This is the lecture for Tuesday, September the 1st. No city-state would ever rise to the prominence of Athens or Sparta or Thebes or any of these cities. Many of the non-Greek influences from the various colonies the Greeks had begun will begin to flow into Greece. Greece began to lose its identity, and by the end of the 300s, Greece is going to be taken over by a stronger nation, Rome. So maybe it would be a good idea at this time to look at what exactly makes Greece Greece. Why do we remember the Greeks? Why do we study the Greeks? Greeks had a philosophy, and the philosophy of the Greeks was moderation and excellence. The Greeks wrote that the noblest thing one could do was through moderation. They said that the gods enjoyed moderation, so you weren't supposed to live it up too much. You were not supposed to get too depressed. The Greeks believed that it was important that everything they do, they strive for excellence. This philosophy became a way of life. Now, later today and tomorrow, we'll look at some of the greatest Greek philosophers. Many Greeks began to tell the story of Greek history. They broke the story down into verse, and poetry could be told about the heroic battles the Greeks have fought, the powers of the gods, the despair of separation of families during times of great turmoil. Now, the performers would be invited into the middle of the stage, and around them the audience would sit, and from the middle of the stage they would talk about, they would recite their poetry, and they would recite poetry, and many times they would be asked to do another, and another, and another. The audiences began to appreciate these tales.
To honor their gods, the ancient Greeks created wonders that forced them to make extraordinary technological discoveries. One such breakthrough was a theatre built to honor the god Dionysius. It was the greatest theatre in the Western world, with the most advanced acoustic design. Hidden in the hills of Epidaurus, about 100 miles from Athens, the 14,000-seat theatre has dazzled audiences for 2,500 years. It is a feat of engineering. 55 rows of stone seats built into the hillside, with such precision that the theatre has perfect acoustics. Surprisingly, the reason for siting the theatre in this remote place has its origin in medicine. Next to the theatre was a vast healing centre, and to the ancient Greeks, theatre was medicine.
One way of trying to understand the link between the healing cult and this particularly exquisite theatre is that for the ancient Greeks, music, and Greek theatre is a fundamentally musical experience, was actually used in medical therapy. The great philosopher Aristotle actually writes about how people who are distressed and psychologically disturbed can come to a great resolution of that and to a much happier state of mind by listening to certain kinds of music and watching certain kinds of performance.
At the adjacent healing centre, the god of medicine, Asclepios, and his magical snakes were said to work miracles. Medical cures and remedies were inscribed on stone tablets. Shrines were built to the cult of Asclepios, and the centre developed into a wealthy healing sanctuary. People came from across the empire to cure every ailment and disability. In 360 BC, the money collected from patients was used to build a vast theatre. The architect, Polykleitos, had already built a roundhouse at the sanctuary, but now set about a far grander circular design. He chose a bowl-shaped site facing west, so the rising sun would light up the landscape behind the stage. He dug out the round performance space before creating the huge seating area, known as the gazing space. thousands of limestone blocks cut from local quarries formed the seats. His design was for 32 rows, although 23 more were added 2 centuries later. Behind the actors was the scaena, the origin of the word scene, a 2-story stage building which was painted as a backdrop for the play. The scaena also enabled early special effects. When a play required a god to descend from the heavens, an actor was flown in on a hoist. The masked performers often played to audiences of up to 14,000 without the benefit of microphones. Polykleitos was able to create perfect acoustics. Even a coin being dropped at the center of the performance circle can be heard clearly in the back rows. The design of the theatre also enhances the sound of the human voice. The secret lies in how sounds are reflected by the stone itself.
A sound is produced by somebody's mouth. It will hit a wall, that's a reflection. And what they've done in Aphrodavros in order to create a large quantity of short reflections is that they've broken up the surface, and that there's no surface which is flat. So when a sound hits a wall, it's diffused in many, many directions. It enhances the original sound by kind of stretching it a little bit longer than it already is.
And in the quest for perfection, the Greeks developed another technique to make the sound even clearer.
When somebody speaks in the theatre, you can hear resonances, and if you have an ear for it, you know which resonances are going to get in the way of the dialogue. So if you were to find something that could take those resonances out, then you're laughing. And that's exactly what they tried to do. They used a resonator which they would tune to the frequencies that they wanted to take out and to the reflections they wanted to take out. And they would embed them in the wall.
2,500 years later, the theatre is still entrancing audiences. The place that has inspired for millennia remains one of the world's finest theatres.
Well, these audiences at these plays demanded more. They told the performers to tell tales of tragedy, to tell tales of drama. Now, the tragedies were created to show how mortal man was punished if he defied the gods. So let's say that the gods tell the mortal man not to do this, but the mortal man does it anyway, and the mortal man is punished. The plays also deal with moderation. Tragic endings are given to those who are too happy or too sad. But that wasn't enough. The performers are asked to do comedies. Now, most of the comedies are what we call satires. They poke fun at the government officials. Satires are a way where the people can laugh at some of the things that their government officials do. Now, notice in the background, these are some of the masks that the actors will wear throughout the service. So an actor could play 6 or 7 parts simply by changing masks. Herodotus was a Greek who had accompanied the Greek army in the wars against Persia. He did his own investigation as to what happened. He collected the facts. He also included myths of what people had told him. He did not let the local pressure of the area color what he wrote. It is because of this that Herodotus is known as the father of history. Theodosius will cover the Peloponnesian Wars. His stories did not delve into myths or legends or stories of gods. He just simply said, this is what happened. And he said, this is what happened in my search for human motives and natural causes. The Greek artists are going to portray the body in heroic poses. The gods were always perfect in human stature and beauty. There were no imperfections. That's one of the easiest ways to tell Greek statues from Roman statues. Roman statues incorporated imperfections in the statues. The Greek buildings were designed to show the power of the gods, to humble the man as he entered. Now, the most famous of the buildings built during the golden age of Athens is the Parthenon. Let's take a look at the Parthenon.
Hurry. I'm your host, Monica Hahn. Let's take a look today at the Parthenon, which stands high above the city of Athens on the Acropolis. This temple to Athena was constructed during a building campaign which followed the Greek successful expulsion of the Persians from Athens in the year 479 BCE. Most of the buildings which had stood on the Acropolis had been destroyed by the Persians. But after their expulsion, and led by the statesman Pericles, an unprecedented building campaign was undertaken by the Athenians. This was not without controversy. The Greek historian Thucydides complained that the Acropolis was adorned like a harlot with precious stones and buildings and sculptures costing far too much. It's interesting to note that originally the Parthenon, which appears snowy white in marble today, was elaborately ornamented and the sculpture was brightly painted. The Parthenon was, of course, a statement of victory and Greek cultural superiority. Many of the sculptural details on the Parthenon depict the Greek gods or the mythical Greek ancestors engaged in victorious battles over their enemies. In the contemporary Greek mind, of course, the Persians would have stood in for the Amazons or for the centaurs who were defeated by the Greeks and the Greek gods in this sculpture. The Parthenon was not only a political statement, however, it also reflects the Greeks' preoccupation with rationality and mathematical harmony. The measurements of the Parthenon adhere to a logical sequence of proportions known as the golden ratio, based on the mathematical Fibonacci sequence. The formula 2x plus 1 also appears throughout the structure. For instance, on the short side there are 8 columns, and on the long side there are 17. 2x plus 1, 2 times 8 plus 1 is 17. The extent to which the adherence to these proportions and formulas was intentional is a matter of some dispute, but what's indisputable is that the Parthenon expresses an extraordinary sense of balance, proportion, and visual unity. Over the 2,500 years of its history, the Parthenon has been a temple dedicated to the virgin Greek goddess of wisdom and war, Athena, but also dedicated to another virgin, the Virgin Mary. In the 6th century, the Parthenon was converted to a Christian church. In the 15th century, it became a mosque after the Ottoman conquest of Greece. In the 17th century, ammunition stored inside the Parthenon by the Ottomans was ignited by Venetian bombardment, severely damaging the structure. The latest fight over the Parthenon involves the marble sculptures, which in 1806 the Earl of Elgin removed with Ottoman permission and sold to the British Museum in London, where they remain. The controversy over the Elgin marbles will be the subject of a future podcast. Thanks for joining me. This has been Art History in a Hurry. See you next time.
Now, if you go to Athens, the most visited spot is the Parthenon. Now, the Parthenon and all the other buildings sit on top of a hill, which is called the Acropolis. Then at the bottom of the hill, this is where the marketplace is, the Agora. And typically when people go to Athens, these are the places that they go to. The Greeks believed that all science could be broken down into elements. Now, they believed that the only elements were earth, water, fire, and air. And so dirt would be earth, oceans would be water, sun was fire, there was air. All elements could be, all substances could be created by the mixing of these 4 elements. The Greeks did a great study of science. They wanted to study science on nature and for the elements. Hippocrates was a scientist who dealt with the human body. He was a scientist who talked about how to treat the injured and the sick. He came up with the idea that physicians should do no harm. Now, if you are going to be a physician or a nurse or anyone who deals with medicine, you will be required to take the Hippocratic Oath. And the Hippocratic Oath states that as a physician or a nurse, you will do no harm. We end today with the Greek philosopher Socrates. Socrates was the first of the well-known Greek philosophers. Socrates was always in trouble with the Athenian government. Socrates believed that you should always strive for truth. Socrates was accused of corrupting the youth. He was asked to change. He refused, and he was sentenced to death. Socrates chose that his death would be by the drinking of poison.
Socrates is arguably the most influential philosopher of all time. His ideas not only changed the course of history, but laid the groundwork for what is today considered Western philosophy. So who was Socrates? Well, Socrates was born in 469 BCE and spent nearly all of his life in Athens, Greece. The city was then at the center of Greece's golden age, a time of rapid development and democratization. He was a soldier, then a stonecutter, before devoting his life to being a philosopher, which literally means lover of wisdom. But little else is known about Socrates' upbringing or the rest of his life because he didn't actually write anything down. In fact, everything we know about him is through the writings of his contemporaries, most famously his student Plato. Plato published a series of dialogues in which Socrates deliberates with politicians and townspeople in Athens. In one of Plato's most famous works, the Symposium, Socrates and his interlocutors discuss the nature of love. Socrates claimed that everything he knows about love was taught to him by a wise woman named Diotima. According to Diotima, love is neither physical or divine, and it cannot be described as good or beautiful. Instead, love is in the desire for something. It is the spirit of seeking something, like people, objects, children, or beauty. Socrates concludes that this relentless pursuit of ideas makes him a lover of knowledge. Socrates had plenty of ideas, but he didn't claim to actually know anything. In fact, he famously said, quote, "True knowledge exists in knowing that you know nothing." In an attempt to uproot ignorance, which he saw as a danger to society, Socrates acted as Athens' gadfly. That is, he went around the city pressing people on their beliefs, ultimately exposing that they knew nothing. This process of gradual questioning, more commonly known as the Socratic method, is perhaps Socrates' greatest contribution to the academic world. It is used as a form of critical discussion in English and law classes, and its influence led to the invention of the scientific method, which is similarly based on challenging hypotheses in an attempt to question their validity. Socrates forced Athenian politicians and social elite to question their own truths, and in more than one instance publicly embarrassed them. He was also an open critic of the city's newly formed democracy, as he said it would ultimately lead to the election of tyrants. As you can imagine, this didn't go over well in Athens, and Socrates was very unpopular. In 399 BCE, he was charged with not believing in the Athenian gods and using his ideas to corrupt the youth, and was sentenced to death by poison. But Socrates didn't resist the verdict, as it was part of the social contract he had tacitly accepted by being a citizen of Athens. Socrates forever changed what we think of as Western philosophy. What was once an attempt to understand the world around us is now largely an examination of our inner motivations and values. Socrates' method of relentless hair-splitting paved the way for other historical gadflies, like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to be vocal critics of their own political system. But because Socrates never wrote anything down and rarely revealed his own opinions, historians have struggled to come to a consensus on even his most fundamental teachings and biographical events. Plato's dialogues are the most comprehensive account of Socrates' beliefs. However, some scholars suspect them to be Plato's own ideas, relayed through his teacher. To this day, it is still unclear whether we really know anything about Socrates at all. We can't do episodes like this without help from our sponsors. This episode was brought to you by K Jewelers. For 100 years, every kiss begins with K. As an intellectual center for philosophers, Athens, Greece played a pivotal role in the rise of Western philosophy. But has Greece remained an influential country in the world? Exactly how powerful is Greece? Find out in this video.
Most of the economy is based on the service sector, as well as merchant shipping and tourism.
And I think we won't worry about this part of the program. So this is as far as we can go today. I remind you that on Thursday you will be writing your paper about either a Greek or an ancient person or an event. You were introduced to quite a bit today. You are not confined by the people who are on the term sheet. Maybe you have heard of a name and you'd like to examine that just a little bit more. And of course, Friday is the day that your paper about the gods is due.